Peterbilt's is federal. Federal.
Can we get the bell? Hello, and welcome to the Center for Cartoon Studies. For those who don't attend here in downtown White River Junction, we're going to have sidewalk soon. Big step for us outside. Thank you all for coming. My name is James Sturm. I'm a cartoonist, and I am also the co-founder of CCS. A few housekeeping things for those that are physically here. Please turn off your phone or put them in airplane mode. Somehow it messes with our wireless audio, and it's really annoying when your phone chirps. And also, thank you for observing our mask policy. So I'm just going to have a few little introduction remarks and acknowledgments, and then I'll turn it over to our panelists. Through its applied cartooning work, CCS has been exploring the potential of comics to engage and educate audiences, build coalitions, and bring people together through public education campaigns. Today's event is a book release of Freedom and Unity, a graphic guide to civics and democracy in Vermont, and a celebration of this work. As all of the cartoonists in this audience know, drawing something connects you and others to it. It's a way to focus attention, beg questions, raise voices. In this way, citizen cartoonists are vital to the process of democracy. And when I say citizen, I'm not talking about it in any legal sense, but as Susan Clark, one of our presenters today, as she defined it in a recent conversation, citizenship is being alive to the needs of your community. And I really love this definition, and I love that I live in a state where this act of citizenship is recognized and supported by others. I want to extend a heartfelt thank you to the Vermont Secretary of State's office and Vermont Humanities, who set this project in motion. Woo. I mean, really, how cool is it to live in a state where the Secretary of State calls you and says, hey, let's make a comic book together? Like, is that happening in Mississippi or Nevada? I don't know. Making Freedom and Unity was similar to how democracy works best. It involved listening to a lot of voices, collaborating in good faith, seeking out expertise on a variety of fronts, and trying to make the most of what resources are available. And speaking of resources, this event is funded by a Vermont Humanities grant as part of their fall festival, and I'd like to thank and acknowledge the festival sponsors. At the University of Vermont, there's the Office of Engagement, the College of Arts and Sciences, and the Humanities Center. The festival media sponsor is Vermont Public, and funding for the book itself came from organizations that include National Endowment for the Humanities, Federation of State Humanities Councils, Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, Vermont Community Foundation, Vermont Arts Council, and the aforementioned Vermont Secretary of State's Office in Vermont Humanities. Okay, so now it's time to introduce today's presenters. There will be two of them. Dan Nott was the leader. Dan Nott was the lead cartoonist of Freedom and Unity. He is a graduate and a faculty member of the Center for Cartoon Studies and the author of the forthcoming graphic novel from Random House, Hidden Systems. He was also the lead cartoonist for CCS's first graphic guide, This Is What Democracy Looks Like, a graphic guide to governance. And joining us virtually is Susan Clark, a writer. A writer and educator focusing on community sustainability and engagement. She is co-author of Slow Democracy, Rediscovering Community, Bringing Decision-Making Back Home, and All Those in Favor, a book about Vermont town meetings. Susan consults with communities across the Northeast on how to build inclusive, deliberative, and empowered public participation. She serves as Middlesex town moderator. And now I will hand things over to Susan. Thank you both for being here.
All right, great. I think I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And thanks everybody for being here. Those of you who are in the room, thanks for masking. I will tell you, I am not there because I actually tested positive for COVID yesterday. Ah! So yay for precautions. You do that. Let's see here. I'm just going to share my screen. How that goes. Yeah. All right. Here we go. I'm super excited to be here. As James mentioned, I'm a facilitator. I've co-authored a couple books on local democracy, slow democracy, which is about deliberative processes across the United States and beyond, and All Those in Favor, which is about Vermont town meetings. And hey, now I've helped out with a third. So I feel like I'm just a small part of this team, which, of course, included James, Kit, Glynis, and Dan, not to mention all the wonderful partners that James talked about. It has been one of the high points of my year to pitch in on this comic. Now, some of you might be wondering how anybody can be excited about democracy right now, because come on, we're experiencing one of the most, polarized and democratically fragile moments in American history. And I totally hear you on that. There are a lot of legitimate reasons to be concerned. We're all exhausted by the impact of the pandemic on individuals and families and the economies. At the same time, the US has been experiencing a long overdue racial reckoning, not to mention repeated climate-related disasters. And, as this picture kind of represents, there's problems with the process. Public engagement is increasingly inflamed by misinformation, social media, and to use a term that Amanda Ripley coined in her book High Conflict, conflict entrepreneurs, right? These are partisans and media outlets who make it their business to sow distrust because they actually benefit from polarization. So, no wonder many of us are sick of democracy. But to me, that's what makes this such a crucial moment to reinvigorate how we talk about democracy. Most of us, I think, if we think about democracy at all, we think about democracy as voting. And voting is super important. We fought hard for the right to vote. We need to safeguard it. We need to expand it. But if the only way we engage in democracy is through the ballot box, democracy is in deep trouble. Democracy really needs us to participate. And that means a lot of things. As Andy Borowitz points out, the earth is desperately in need of folks who can take in new information, who have the curiosity to move beyond, polarized stances and the patience and the skills to sit there and hear each other out. And in these divisive times, it's really hard to get together and talk with other humans. And yet, it may be the only thing that is going to save us. If we're going to solve our problems, we need to push together. We need everyone to embrace and celebrate that democracy is a we and not a they. So there was a ton of Vermont-based wisdom that went into this collaboration, from the Secretary of State's office, the Humanities Council, the State House, the Abenaki Arts and Education Center, and many others. For my part, I spent a lot of time just gabbing with Dan about Vermont democracy. And, I would just kind of sit there and blather on, for ages about why we make decisions the way we do. Topics in my research, ranging from Vermont history and things that have divided us and things that have convened us over the centuries. Frank Bryan's 30 years of data collection and analysis of Vermont's town meetings, new democratic tools like participatory budgeting, all the way to psychology and brain science, and navigating wicked problems and polarities. And one of those polarities, paradoxes, which is the title of our comic book, Freedom and Unity. Vermont's motto is a paradox. And Dan would just kind of sit there and go, tell me more, you know. And all my sort of linear thinking and academic concepts would kind of go into these cartoonist brains. I had no idea what was going to come out. What would Dan and this team make of all the stuff that, you know, I was throwing at them, let alone all the other materials that they were reading and the people they were talking to? And I'll tell you, it was so much fun to see what was coming back. I just can't believe how much is packed in here. I think it's solid. It is full of key concepts, and it is so much more accessible than anything I said to them. So it's not perfect, of course, like anything that any human beings have ever made. But I hope this comic will serve as a welcoming beacon, which is what our democracy needs right now. I think every page is an invitation to further discussion. And I hope it will be a tool to boost our energy, to strengthen our resilience, and to invest in our democratic future. So thanks.
Thank you, Susan. Can everyone hear me okay? All right, so I'm going to take over for a few minutes, and I want to talk a little bit about this comic and the idea of untangling using comics and collaborating with comics, and also make the case for why Vermont is an interesting place to make a comic about. So I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes. Just to give you an overview, I'm going to start by doing like a quick reading of the introduction to the comic. I know most of you probably just got it, so this will give an overview of sort of what is in there. Then I'll run through some of the pages and the topic contained within it. I'm going to talk a little bit about my work and my approach to helping develop the graphic guides and sort of see them develop over the past few years. I'm going to talk about the process in making this Vermont comic, and then we'll have time for questions and discussion at the end with Susan as well. Okay, so here's the first page. If you have the comic, you can follow along. There are many things that make Vermont a unique and sometimes puzzling place to live. It has a very small population, just over 500,000 people. In even smaller communities, more than half of Vermonters live in communities that are 2,500 people or less. Vermont's landscape is famous for its natural beauty. Billboards are illegal here. And also for its difficult winters and a pre-spring mud season. Vermont has a long history of immigration, but is less racially diverse than almost any other state in the US today. Vermont is known for its progressive values, but also has this really prominent conservative tradition. Even the state's motto suggests a curious duality. So what does all this mean for how we practice democracy in Vermont today? The idea of Vermont democracy has meant different things to different people over time. The Latin root means rule by the people. People have called it different names besides democracy. But it tends to mean something like people coming together to govern themselves. If that seems unlike the state of government in the US right now, well, you're not wrong. Democracy is much deeper than elections. It's an ideal that people and communities have used to solve collective problems throughout history, from Native Americans like the Iroquois, whose confederacy influenced the US founders, to community groups in modern neighborhoods. Democracy tends to work differently everywhere, and over time, Vermont has developed its own approaches. Vermont's democracy is influenced by its landscapes, culture, and history, and a desire to balance freedoms for individuals with the collective good. So in Vermont, democracy is an ideal that shapes the government and communities, and it's this range of approaches for participation and representation. Acknowledge right off the back, way more than we can fit in this comic. And this comic asks, where did these processes come from? What challenges did these systems face? And what does democracy ask of us? By exploring these questions, we can understand how Vermont systems work today, how they might work in the future, and the history of the region that became Vermont. So I'm going to just go through some of these pages and just let you know sort of what's in the comic and what we're going to be talking about. Here we're looking at the history of the region, including how the area that became Vermont is essentially the center of a larger homeland of the Abenaki people called Endokina. This comic describes how Vermont was created and also how the landscape influenced this tradition of town meeting. The comic focuses a lot on town meeting. We have this page spread about what town meeting is and how it works as this really rare form of deliberative democracy in the US, where citizens in the town for a day serve as legislators to handle the town's business. We have a page spread that looks at the different layers of representative government, from the municipal level to the legislature, governor, and a couple panels on our federal representatives. And then we zoom out to see Vermont as a patchwork of different communities and showing how these different layers of government are often in conflict with each other and how there's this inherent tension between who should have the power to do what in the state. We also have a page talking about some of the anti-democratic histories of Vermont and the reality that many people are either unable or made to feel unwelcome participating in Vermont's democratic spaces. And also talking about some of the work that's been done over time to improve it. So the comic then kind of switches from talking about how things are set up to depicting some of the problems and solutions that the state faces. We have a page about the Abenaki people who continue to live across the wider region, including across the border in Canada, and continue to deal with the effects of colonization. And we also have a page about how towns are working to adapt an old town meeting tradition that's, now about 200 years old. We talk about democracy outside of government through co-ops, grassroots organizing, restorative justice, and mutual aid, and ask a bunch of questions about what we can be doing to make our state and communities more democratic. So applying these principles of democracy to all the places that we don't normally expect it, like public safety and healthcare and schools and workplaces. And so we end by discussing the benefits of local democracy in creating resilient communities and also helping us personally. And understanding this idea of freedom and unity as a process of working through tensions to find something that fits our time and place. Okay, so that's the idea of the comic in like 3 minutes. So there's a lot more to it, and I hope you all read it, and it brings up some questions and conversation about the state and the approach. But I want to talk a little bit about my role in this process. So there were a lot of organizations involved. James mentioned this, Susan mentioned this, and all of them have like slightly different missions. All wanted a comic book, but all want slightly different things, right? The Secretary of State's office, among other things, oversees elections. Vermont Humanities helps foster Vermont's culture and arts. CCS is promoting the use of applied cartooning. And Susan Clark is a scholar and a champion of deliberative democracy. So our job here was to bring these different goals together and also filter it through our perspective and our lens. So I want to take a few minutes and talk about my background and how I came to do this type of work. Going way back, like most kids, I drew comics, and even from a young age, was interested in using comics to talk about things that I cared about. This is a comic from middle school featuring Chip the rainforest tree, talking about biodiversity. And as a middle schooler, I was really affected by 9/11 and really horrified by the US invasion of Iraq, and found myself very preoccupied with thinking about power and political violence and the US's place in the world. And also sort of like an understanding of how these things all fit together with capitalism and corruption. These were cartoons that I was drawing in high school before I became a cartoonist. And I actually didn't study art at all in college. I continued along this path of studying international relations and conflict and wrote a lot of papers. Just was thinking very big picture. I went to UMass Amherst, so like most things were just sort of like watching lectures in these big lecture halls, thinking about these big questions. By the end of my time at undergraduate, I was interested in using art as a way to make some of these concepts that I was learning about more accessible. I was like, you can only write so many political science papers before you're like no one's reading these, or like I don't see what the effect is having. So, I started off by being really interested in like, oh, I wonder if I can be using art to like translate some of these academic concepts that aren't as accessible. And like editorial cartoons were like the thing, they were just like the most obvious way for me to do that, of combining sort of journalism and art and academics. So I did a thesis on sort of like trying to understand this visual language to discuss complicated political issues and current events. So after college, I worked a day job repairing cell phones and drew weekly political cartoons, again, often with this like kind of international focus. So like for this, like I researched all these governments that were doing, curtailing the freedom of the press, and I like found ways of putting it all in there. And it was just really like the only format that I knew how to do this type of work in, right? Like it was like the most obvious. Thinking about it now, it's interesting like how hard comics are to find sometimes. Like I didn't know that other types of comics existed in this way, or that we could be doing things like the graphic guides. So I was really interested in this idea of combining research and art, but also still felt pretty limited to the single panel format or single images. I would do these big drawings and then like annotate them with write-ups. So this was in like 2014 when Google started buying all these other companies and transitioning from a search engine to like something much bigger, much more extensive. I became really interested in making work about the horror of mass incarceration in the US and trying to like show a timeline of that and show the extent of it. And again, I was like kind of combining write-ups and research with art, but I didn't know how to like put them together. I think a lot of people in this room probably take it for granted now, like how hard it can be to learn to make comics. Like I didn't really know how to do that, but luckily there is CCS. So many years later, I enrolled in CCS, and to skip forward a bit, I explored a lot of ways of making comics during my time here. My thesis project was a collection of comics, including a 50-page book about untangling the metaphors that we use to describe the internet. So things like a cloud or a superhighway, like we have all these different ways of talking about it, and I was like, what if we could use drawings to visualize that? But then also like compare it to how it actually works. So this is like a picture of an actual undersea cable, which is how most global information travels across the world. It's in these like garden hose sized tubes underneath the ocean. Here's a map of like where they go to connect all of the cities and computers and continents across the world. And then I also started integrating history into this format. Because the story and how these things came to be really interested in me. Like a lot of the internet cables trace the same pathways that the original telegraph cables took like hundreds of years before. So I used the same format to explore the electric grid and water systems, and I worked on this for the past 4 years, and 250 pages later, they'll be released as my first book next year, which James mentioned. I'm excited about it. But back to the graphic guides. So after I graduated, I had just finished the internet comic, and James sent me a message with an idea for a comic about democracy, with this beautiful image that Karen Chapp had developed. And this is like kind of what we had at the time. Like, don't share this yet, please, was the message. So James had this vision for a comic book about democracy and civics that could be distributed either for free or really inexpensively, and asked me to help develop it. And I was like, yeah, of course. Like, finally, I'm finding sort of a way to combine like my interest in politics and comics and like make it really accessible. So I remember going to the Dartmouth Library and looking for books about civics and democracy, and suddenly just becoming like really, really overwhelmed by like how many books have been written on this topic and just like where to start in general. And I was like, okay, so with this format, like what would actually be useful to people in having like a 32-page comic book? So I realized that even though I studied political science and read the news like every day, and in a lot of ways like identified with being like informed about the world, there were like very basic things that I didn't know about, like the difference between how the House and the Senate worked, or like how the court system works. So I turned to some educational resources like PBS's great crash course series, which I recommend. And I started sort of relearning all this stuff that I probably learned like a really long time ago, and it's just like expected that we remember it for the rest of our lives. And I took lots of notes on what seemed important about the different branches of government and how it works, and really like paying attention to things that I felt surprised that I didn't know, right? Sometimes I'm like, wow, I can't believe I didn't know that. And I'm like, that's probably something that should be in this comic. And I was also thinking about how it's really common in video and even with prose to break things into chapters. And I thought that maybe I could do that with comics and combine some of the sequential elements of comics and the like inviting and imaginative elements of cartooning with the structure of like a reference book or an infographic. We talk a lot about how comics allows you to sort of move visually through something at your own pace instead of like watching a video. And I thought maybe that having like all of this information in one place at once could be useful. So this is like sort of the first structure. This is like the hardest thing to figure out. It's like the most simple drawing, but like how is this going to be structured? How is it going to come together? So I worked in page spreads on printer paper to develop the concepts and write the text. And there were some really fun collaborations with James here too. This is one of my favorite parts about working on these graphic guides is sort of the ability to work in teams. He did like some pencil pages and wrote some of the initial text for the conclusion. And still like looking at this comic, I think some of those are like the strongest pages in the book. So in this first project was really, really iterative. Like it started off, I think I put it over there with me just like folding paper together and like just trying to draw the comic and like get something down that we could like talk about and review. And that every, month or so I'd print out a new version of it that I could carry around and that we could talk about. I was constantly meeting James in the studio and we would go through sort of like how it was working. And yeah, and when this came out, I remember being shocked at like how many of these you can make compared to like books, right? Because they're really like pretty inexpensive to produce. They're easy to like mail. They're easy to hand out and pass around, right? Like, so I really like that about the format. And even with this Vermont comic, I mean, like the initial print run is like significantly more than like my book with Random House will be, right? Because it's like, it's a format that allows for like sort of this mass dissemination in a way that you can't do with like $20 books. So I really enjoyed seeing sort of work in this format, and it was getting at some of the things that I really wanted to get at early on when I started considering this type of work. And sort of the concept that really stuck with me is this idea of untangling using comics, of using comics to depict both our abstract understandings of something and then follow it by unpacking it with specificity and clarity. So getting a sense, this image was important to me for that comic because I wanted something that you could like get a sense of what the whole comic was from one image, right? Like if I can just show you this, then you'll get a sense of like what the whole comic is trying to do. And I think that's also something kind of unique about this format. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the process of pulling this all together in a collaborative way. So I mentioned that each of these organizations had a vision, and my job was to combine them while sort of filtering it through my own lens and James and Kit's as well. So I want to cite a few people who shaped my thinking over the past couple years. The work of Astra Taylor, whose books and documentary explore democracy as a series of tensions that we're working through but will never quite solve. So this documentary is a really good exploration of this question. She also wrote a book called Democracy May Not Exist, but We'll Miss It When It's Gone. And this specifically is organized by looking at the various tensions embedded in democracy that we're always kind of navigating but never quite getting, there's no way to sort of like get to a final answer for them. On a similar note, Jamel Bouie has been writing about this in a similar way recently on the New York Times, and I just wanted to point this out. He was writing about seeing democracy as tensions and contradictions. For instance, this tension between democracy and authoritarianism in the US that's actually like always existed from the beginning of the country. right? And how like both the traditions of authoritarianism and democracy have framed our ideas about who exactly can enjoy American freedom and American liberty. I was influenced by the anthropologist David Graeber, whose work explores how the world is something that we make and could just as easily make differently. So this is the idea that like everything around us is based off of a decision that was made, right? And that we should like have agency in shaping the ways that we live and not just taking it for granted as like something that was like, it had to exist this way. And the Vermont writer Murray Bookchin, who wrote, he went through like a lot of political ideologies across his lifetime and his books, but ended up writing a lot about local towns and cities as having this sort of best opportunity to create like a real face-to-face democracy and like really the sort of the place for democracy to happen. So I was influenced by the movement politics of Vermont these past few years, groups like Vermont's Black Lives Matter and Rights and Democracy. And I found that, you know, like just showing up for these events was really the best way to be hearing from people across the state. I was changed my media diet from like, you know, reading a lot of international news and the New York Times to like focusing more on like understanding what's going on locally. Reading V.T. Digger and the Valley News and Vermont Public. It also is like the only way to know what's going on like legislatively in the state and to be following like what are people actually trying to fix about the state. And I was also seeing all the way that people in the communities were organizing on their own to help each other, like particularly during the height of the pandemic, down the street seeing the local church put out these bins for people to drop off food and pick up food, and then seeing it kind of like evolve into this like continuous food pantry that like Cover Store helped build was like, to me, it was like, oh, that's like an aspect of democracy that like people are doing on their own. And I thought that that was inspiring as well. I'm also like pretty involved in the community here. I've been volunteering at Restorative Justice for 4 years. And this past year was on the committee to revise the town's charter, which is sort of like the document at the source of a town's power and authority. So I was also like kind of getting this experience of like seeing some of this stuff in action and like not just thinking about it abstractly and seeing sort of the limits of it sometimes as well. So the last thing I'll say about my own perspective in terms of like the lens that I'm filtering this through is that as I mentioned earlier, I was like really globally and nationally focused for much of my life. And something that had a big effect on me is that this guy that I knew from like a DIY music scene ran for mayor of Athens, Georgia in 2013. And I thought it was like so wild. And he ended up like helping to create a movement there to bring progressive politics to the city. The cartoonist Eleanor Davis, who lives there, is also a part of this movement and made this poster. And I had just like never really before considered local government as like a site for this kind of like engagement. Like so much of the politics that I was interested in was happening at the faraway national level. So seeing this like kind of made this like hidden area of politics visible for me. So when James was talking to me about this project, he could probably tell that I got really excited about how this comic could bring some clarity to sort of what democracy looks like in Vermont. James and Susan and Kit had already done a ton of work gathering materials and asked me to take a look at it with fresh eyes. So this is some process stuff, especially for the cartoonists in the room. They asked me to work on an outline. So I started making what James always calls a book map. I was using like a slide deck to arrange an order for the concepts on each page. It's a little different when you're working on nonfiction than when you're doing like traditional storytelling. It's a little bit more like an essay, and you have to figure out sort of how the concepts are flowing together. So sometimes I started to sketch pages in and add them in here. But this was really, really hard. I was using their outlines, and I remember getting really stuck trying to do it on slides, and I took this like tactile approach to like cutting out little pieces of paper and moving them around, trying to figure it out. And I kept getting stuck about halfway through where the comic switches from showing about how things actually work to like talking about like the problems and the solutions and figuring out how to do that without just making it a list. So sometimes when you're looking back on comics, you forget like how hard they are to work on. And when I was like looking at this, I like remembered the frustration of being like, I can't figure this out. Like, so structuring this much information was really, I think, one of the hardest parts of the comic for me. So every week we were meeting as a group and discussing, and I was also talking with Susan, as she mentioned, so I was asking a lot of questions and taking notes, working on the structure. Here are some notes from that Astra Taylor documentary. So this is like a big part of my process too, is like sort of taking in media and like filtering it through, like noticing what like stands out to me and kind of making art out of it. There's this movie about Vermont history that's like 6 hours long, and I like watched the whole thing and like took notes on each of the parts of it. I was listening to like Brave Little State episodes and taking notes on them that way. And this was a great way to start generating images and generating content for the comic. And then I started to plan these out in grids. So this is like what the first draft of one of my comics usually looks like. And this is actually sort of the same process that I used for the first Democracy comic as well. Just starting with these like very loose ideas and kind of leveling them up with each draft. And it's always funny to look back and see like how much of it actually really kind of carries through. I tried something different with this comic that I had never done before. And for the next step after working on this like really, really loose phase, I took like a thick uni pen and I just started drawing straight to ink and added the text later in InDesign. So these were all just like on printer paper, and then I scanned them in and I changed the line art color and added some color behind. But like I didn't really know what the text was going to be, but I had like a sense, you know, going back to right, like I had a sense of like what each part of the page was going to look like, or like the topics that were going to be covered. But I allowed myself to just do the drawings and figure out the text later. And this actually worked great. It like gave us a structure to work with while we moved pieces around and wrote the details of the comic. So we were able to work with this like rough draft of the comic for months. And this was especially important working with a group, right? Because you need something to be able to pass back and forth and to share with each other. Right, there was like a ton of emails like this where like people would be writing different notes, and I would be talking about like how to integrate them. And we kind of just moved this process along through the drafts. I included this because I think it's funny, like looking back, like how much carries over from like the first notes that I was taking on like a Brave Little State episode, and like, you know, little drawings sort of make their way even from like the first notes all the way to the final art. So a lot of it is just putting something down on paper that you can then like keep working with, I think. One of the biggest, hardest questions to include, and this relates to the structure, was just how much space to give everything in a topic that's so big. There's this element of like a comic like this is kind of collage-like, right? It's like about the impression that you want to give as someone's moving through it. We could have easily had like 3-page spreads about the legislature and one about the governor. But instead, the legislature gets like 2 half pages and the governor gets a single panel. Like, you know, and it could have been done so many different ways. But we were constantly thinking about like, what's the impression that you want to give? And focus on things based off of their like proximity to people's daily lives and like this focus on participatory democracy. Okay, so I also want to point out that Glynis was helping out with this project, and there was like these really, really fun art collaborations that I got to do with her. So like I would pass her these rough pages that I did with the UniPen, like the straight to ink pages. And then she would liven them up and like really help to capture this sort of Vermont landscape. And then I would like kind of combine the two into the final art. Here's another rough sketch I did for that sort of one of the bigger opening pages. This was her rough pencils. So you can see she was kind of taking the structure but doing her own thing with it, and then I was able to like kind of combine both of our approaches for the final. We only got to do this for a couple of pages in the comic, but it was really fun, and I learned like a ton just from like a few instances of collaborating with another cartoonist in this. She also handed over a few sketchbook pages, and I grabbed some of her characters from them, and they sort of make their way into different drawings. Yeah, so I want to briefly touch on 3 interesting things that I learned about Vermont before wrapping up this portion of it. And one is the tension between towns and the state in Vermont. And I thought this was really interesting because like a town can change how it operates by way of its charter, by tweaking these sentences in a document. It can provide power to individuals or groups, including protections. And we have this like local focus in Vermont, but there's also this this procedure that like the state needs to actually okay everything that's done at the town level. And it's like this really interesting tension in Vermont of like, there is this local control and this focus on like local participatory democracy, but then this like state control over everything, and like something can pass like a town and the legislature and still be vetoed by the governor at a local level. And I was trying to think of different ways to like actually show that visually as well. I was really interested in like this question of like why there are so many co-ops in Vermont, and I was asking Susan about it too, and learned that like it wasn't really like profitable for a lot of businesses to come to Vermont because there were not that many people here, and there's not like a ton of industry. So people sort of formed these co-ops to bring in food and to bring in other services when like business wouldn't provide them here. Another thing that was kind of interesting to learn about was that there were these, I was really interested in like thinking about different ways that like we kind of exclude young people from democracy, even though they're like probably the most affected by most of the policies going through and have like really unique insight. And Vermont has this cool program for youth councils that involves participatory budgeting, where young people can create projects and get funding for them and carry them out. And like literally while we were working on this, like the state also created a new statewide youth council that allows for young people to advise the governor and the legislature. So it was kind of fun to be following these things in real time and trying to add them into the comic as well. So to close out, I just want to read the conclusion to the comic, or an abridged version of the conclusion, before jumping into question and answer. So we know the benefits of bringing diverse groups of people together and of locally focused democracy. Coming together, we realize that being an expert doesn't mean having a degree or certification. It's about wisdom and lived experience developed over time, all of which a community needs. We also know that in times of crisis, local connections help neighbors respond quickly and maintain resilient communities. The listening, mediation, and engagement required for democracy helps us personally. Changes how we think of where we fit in the community, providing us with skills and a sense of belonging that carries over to other aspects of our lives. It's no surprise then that people who participate in democratic processes, joining the town's housing committee, are more likely to be involved in other aspects of the community as well, whether being part of a co-op or a reliable neighbor, because engaging in local democracy can be a powerful form of self-expression. Freedom and unity isn't about making something perfect. It's about working through these tensions to create something that fits for our time and place. Accepting the challenges of democracy allows us to appreciate what makes Vermont unique and embrace our roles in its future. Thank you. So I'm putting Susan back up on the screen now. So now is our opportunity to take questions and to talk. I know I have questions for Susan even after working with her for so long, but if anyone would like to start, feel free. Otherwise, I can jump in with something.
And I'll say this, if you've got a question, Jared and myself will be passing around a microphone. While you clearly don't need the microphone in the room, the folks who are at home do need the microphone so that they can hear the question. So we've got one right here.
About how many sources did you use to make this? Like, how many sources did you draw on, and how did you make your decisions on what to use and how much to use of each?
Yeah, that is a great question. So we had more sources than could fit in the actual comic. So there is actually like a landing page on Cartoon Studies website that has like the rest of the sources. Yeah, I don't know exactly how many sources we used, but it was this really large mix of documentaries and like following current events. Really, what I was trying to do instead of just like reading books is like talking to people, and that was what was so great about this collaboration, is that there were so many different organizations involved, and we had like so many meetings of people that had such specific expertise. That I was able to kind of like take this structure and like put forward some ideas, and really like get feedback and have that be like sort of the sources. It was like through these like meetings and through these dialogues that we were having with different people. I mean, for pretty much each section or tier in this comic, we like talked to someone who had expertise in it. And some of it is about that, and some of it is also just about bringing together information that's scattered all over the place, like how many state senators there are, how many representatives there are, or like what the cycle looks like, and things like that that are readily available, but they're just like not in one place. Yeah. And I'll let Susan take questions too. Can you hear okay, Susan? Okay, great.
Did you get any feedback or input from like real life like political leaders in local and state government in Vermont into making this?
In terms of like the types of things that we were talking about?
Yeah, kind of learning about the stories and the stuff you say about freedom and unity in Vermont.
Yeah, I don't know, Susan, do you have anything to say about that?
It's such a rich treasure trove in Vermont because every town has a 3 or 5 member select board and a town clerk, and there's 252 towns and cities in Vermont, and so I think Dan had a lot of conversations. I know our research in all of those in paper and Slow Democracy was based on tons and tons of conversations. But I also think the Secretary of State's office, I know they have a 1-800 number. They get calls all the time from municipal officials. And so I think this comic was informed by all of those ongoing conversations over time. But some of the people involved, like the Secretary of State's office, those are elected officials, and they have a municipal service office, and so they're dealing with local officials all the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think a number of people on the team were also elected officials, and I run into Becca White at the co-op all the time, right? There's something kind of unique about Vermont in that way, that it's like not that hard to talk to your elected officials. But at the same time, like I think a lot of this comic, and maybe what's unique about it, is this focus on the sort of aspects of democracy that aren't electoral, and sort of combining more traditionally what we think about in terms of representative government with these things that like are a little bit closer to people's everyday lives.
Yeah, like I'm a town moderator. It's a 4-hour-a-year job, but it's a lot of talking to people.
Susan, I have a question for you. I was wondering how in your work and your research and talking about town meeting. You navigate between different audiences in talking about these issues. Like I know that you probably also talk to like a bunch of academics, but you're also like so thoughtful about trying to make this stuff accessible, and sort of how you frame things differently or go about talking to different audiences about issues of democracy and how people can participate.
Yeah, no, you definitely do use different words and different sort of framings depending on your audience. And like I gave a talk just the other day to the American Planning Association, the Northern New England section of that group, and that's a group that you can use lots of facts and statistics and lots of jargon. Whereas if I'm listening and trying to understand what kinds of issues a select board is facing, that's just not useful. And that's what's so exciting to me about this comic, is that it's one more way to take what can be kind of, it seems like theoretical stuff, and make it so much more, I think, alive for audiences. And this is what we need. We need comics. We need YouTube videos. We need TikToks if it takes that to have the full range of ways that people can see that democracy is for them.
Great.
So my question is about distribution, kind of exactly what you're saying. So what is the plan for getting this to, out there? I'm on the select board, and I want to bring a bunch back for everybody else on the select board, and I want to give it to all my students, and, what's the plan for getting it out there?
Well, the comic is available for free online. And it is available for free here today. I think that it's part of, James can probably speak more to this actually. So I'm
going to punt over there. During my remarks, I should have had Chris Winters from the Secretary of State's office and Christopher Kaufman-Ilstrup from Vermont Humanities take a bow, because they're here in the audience. So if you would just mind standing just for a moment, just so we can acknowledge both of you. So, Christopher, I'm going to hand the mic over to you about distribution a little bit. I will say that individual copies can be bought at our local independent bookstore, Norwich Bookstore. So that's one place to go and find copies. But for distribution, Christopher, I'll let you talk to them.
There's a lot of copies. There's more than 20,000 copies sitting in our garage at Vermont Humanities and in several other places. So I know, for example, that the comic will be handed out to every kid who comes to the State House for a State House tour for as long as they last. They will be distributed through the Secretary of State's office, through town meeting day, and to municipal officials. You can get them as many copies as you want from the Secretary of State's office. From our office at Vermont Humanities, I know we're giving copies to the Snelling Center for Government to distribute to their alumni through Vermont Leadership Institute and Vermont School Leadership Institute. We're giving copies to the Vermont Council on Rural Development to distribute at their community visioning processes around the state. The Vermont League of Cities and Towns will be distributing them to town managers, and it kind of goes on and on. I also want to emphasize that Vermont Abenaki Artists Association was really critical in helping us to understand how Vermont democracy overlays a much older system. And so I know that they've been distributing copies as well at many of the Indigenous Peoples Day events that happened over the last couple of weeks. They had sort of an advance box to bring around to their festivals. And we really appreciated their support. So if you need copies, you can talk to Chris, to me, to Dan, to Susan. We all have them, and we're all happy to give you as many as you want.
Hello, great job on this. It's really an incredible project. I was wondering if there was anything that you feel like you wish you could have included, if you had like half a page more or a few pages more, like what was left? What was left that really struck you on the kind of cutting room floor because of the project?
Yeah, it's such a good question, and I think about this all the time. There's so many things that you could include about a comic about Vermont, right? And there's, I think, a lot of times that we had to dial it back and be like, wait, this is a separate comic. Like, it just has to be like a different comic. I mean, something that I think is referenced in this comic, and we do talk about, but probably could use more space, is this idea of like who feels comfortable accessing certain spaces, and these the way things are set up are not necessarily equal for everyone, and there's this idea of how privilege comes into play in your ability. I always think of privilege as the ease at which you can navigate space, and I think it's really true in local democracy. But trying to unpack what privilege means and to talk about that in this context would have required many pages of comics to do it justice, right? And there's a certain thing that happens in these comics where we only have so much space that you can't just talk about something briefly like that. You're not going to be able to do it justice, and it can end up being kind of offensive to gloss over something like that. But that was something that I was thinking about a lot, is how to sort of get at this question that's really important here in Vermont, is how do we deal with the reality that many people are uncomfortable participating in these great democratic systems that we have in the state. So if I had a whole other comic book to do, that's what I would like to see more of.
Yeah, if I can chime in, I would say probably there are so many polarities. There's so many of these kinds of two things that you think are opposites, but actually have to coexist that are in democracy and that are in this comic that I think Dan captured so well, and the team, freedom and unity being among them. And for me, one of the pieces that if there were another comic, I would love to explore is the question of democratic quantity and democratic quality, and how those two things can be in tension. Yes, we want lots and lots of people voting, and we also want, a rich, vibrant, informed deliberation where people can tell their stories, where they can actually see each other, where they can change their minds. And that's a tension. It's tension for sure. And there's the question of privilege is embedded in there, but also questions of culture. How do we express ourselves? And some of us express ourselves better with, stories and experiences than just with, the efficiency of checking a box. So that's another fascinating tension that I think is really rich for exploration in Vermont.
Yeah, and just on that as well, I mean, I think that this comic started off being mostly about the process of town meeting, and there's a part of me that's sad to lose some of that, because you read these histories of democracy, and the New England town meeting is something that is a really rare instance of this community democracy across human history. It's really there's not that many examples of these kind of systems that have lasted a really long time, at least in sort of the Western canon of democracy. So I would have loved to have more about town meeting as well, and just the things that are being done to adapt it and keep it relevant in 2022.
So a lot of times when we were talking, it was in the middle of a lot of political turmoil. When you're researching democracy in this day and age, everyone feels a little like Chicken Little. This is a question I'd like you to start with, Susan. It's whenever we have these meetings, I always left feeling a little reassured about everything, and always in admiration about how kind of you could work through all this in such a positive way, but also with, without, having, rose-colored glasses on either. And how do you do that? How do we hold on to the hope as we get under the hood of what's happening on these news cycles and not just news cycles, what is actually happening in our country?
Wow, great question. It's really, really easy for me, and I think probably for all of us, to lean into despair. There's a lot on the news right now that is very, very discouraging. And I've kind of discovered that hope isn't a super useful tool for me, because I feel that hope and fear are two sides of the same coin. And there's some like Buddhist stuff in here probably, but it's for me, it's more about what am I here for? What am I getting up in the morning to do, and what do I bring to the conversation today to make it move forward in a way that I think is constructive. And for me, it's less about joining the fight or hoping that thinking about the end result that things are going to get better, and more about the process of making them better. I'm really fascinated by the process, and I think that the more we can put our energy into the process, the richer our days are going to be. And sort of that's where I have to put my focus.
Dan has mentioned before this like thing you get to do sometimes when you're a cartoonist, where you get to be like, I'm a cartoonist, can I interview you for a comic I'm working on? And how fun that can be, and like the new people you can get to meet with that. And I know that there was a whole team working on this project, so maybe some of those were like within the team itself, but did you get that opportunity making this book? And did you have any really fun conversations like that?
Oh my God, yes, it was so fun. Like, I mean, Susan and I were talking about this last night, that just like being able to talk with Susan about all these topics and to, like get really excited every time was really like a highlight of working on this. I love being a part of a community. And, you like kind of make friends. And, you like kind of make friends through these processes as well. I think working on this like encouraged me to also like to join like a town committee as well, and like get involved in that process. So it's interesting using comics as like like a lifestyle almost, of like like thinking about like using them to learn about things, and like sort of leaning into like this ability to meet people and to like help convey different messages. And it was the same thing working on my book too. Like, it was like really fun to be able to talk to like the person who runs the town's water system, and like how much he knew about like running the town's water system, and how much he cared about the pipes of the town, and like, just these people that you would never get a chance to like interact with, but everyone is really passionate about, what they're working on, and it's nice to be able to share in that as a cartoonist. Question here.
Were there any moments when you were drawing your concept art for various different ideas or concepts that you couldn't really choose which one was better?
That's a good question. I'm trying to think of any specific moments that came up, but I think what I kind of showed before, that things start off so rough that a lot of my sort of process of choosing drawings comes from sort of like taking things from this like very rough initial sketch that has like so much different potential, and like drawing it like a few times and kind of seeing where it goes. So the process is never like, oh, I'm not sure exactly what to draw here. It's like starting with these like very rough sketches and then just like allowing them to evolve from like a smaller outline, if that makes sense. It's like taking a rough sketch and allowing it to become like a final pencil drawing, and then like finished art. And each of those I'm adding like a little bit of different character to it. So So I do get nervous sometimes that like I showed like on those initial sketches that I'm like doing really, really quick drawings just to have a structure down, like knowing that eventually a lot of those drawings will make it into the comic, but at the time I'm not thinking that consciously about it because I just need to get something down. So I don't know if other cartoonists find that too, but like sometimes you're putting ideas down and you're allowing them to like evolve over time, and it's not that conscious of a process of like what goes down in terms of images.
But again, like, what if you're in a position where you have conflicting ideas or conflicting illustrations that both seem both seem to get at the same point, and you love both of them, but you can't apply both of them?
That's actually a great question, and there's always another place to put those images, right? There's like something that I didn't talk about in here that I always do in comics too is that like I leave like a few blank panels somewhere in the comic because I know that when I'm like 3/4 of the way done with the comic, I'm gonna remember things that I should have included. So there's always these extra places to put drawings or ideas like at the last minute. Or if I have a drawing that I really like that I couldn't find a way in, it's a great thing to use like on the end papers of a comic or on like the back page or something like that. So there's lots of different ways to sort of like incorporate drawings. And I think the same thing is true with like writing, right? There's sometimes I can't fit an idea into like the narrative, but I like find some other way to sort of make it a part of the final package.
I have two questions, so I'll say both of them. But along the lines of developing visuals, I know that in some of your previous work, you sort of come up with a strong visual metaphor to carry the essay or to carry the logic through. And I was wondering how you developed that for talking about democracy and what that process was like, if it was intuitive, if there was, I think I saw some like threads and quilts in there, how you came to those ideas. And then my second question, I know that also for the previous democracy comic, you and some folks would go into schools and sort of do this engagement side of talking about democracy. And is there plans to do that for this comic as well?
Yeah, on the second question, I don't currently have any plans to do that, but I would love to. This is my first time talking publicly about the comic, which is why I'm searching for words. What's that? The answer is yes. Great. Thank you for answering that. Yeah, and as far as visual metaphor, that's, I think that idea of untangling keeps coming up, and I think it's something that works really well for this format. And I wasn't really sure what to do for Vermont in the same way, because I think people have different conceptions of Vermont, right? Like, I think so I think that the closest I came to that is there's that drawing of Vermont that's like kind of like a three-dimensional like cutaway drawing. And I like that format because it almost feels like something you can hold in your hand. And I like drawing things like that, drawing these like really big things that like you can approach in like an accessible way and like feel like you can hold it all in one place. So I think that's sort of what I came up with for that. And then, yeah, also this idea of like a thread and this sort of final patchwork quilt is throughout the comic. Susan, do you have any good ideas about visual metaphors for the comic, or did anything come up for you? I think what's interesting about visual metaphors is they're just like, they're replicating how we talk about things, right? Like, even though we talk about visual metaphors as cartoonists, like we also just speak in metaphors all the time without realizing it in terms of talking about democracy. And I feel like that's something that came up a lot when Susan and I were talking.
We talked a lot about the fabric of community. And I think that a quilt metaphor came and went in the visuals for this cut. I don't even remember. Did the quilt stay in? There was definitely
There's a
quilt.
little bit of it, but I tried not to be like too like hitting you over the head with the quilt metaphor, you know. Yeah.
what I really like about this, at least in my opinion, is how you made this so accessible and easy, kind of informative and easy to read, to understand this really important topic. How did you work? I'm curious of how you worked to get to that point of making this so accessible for such a large group of people to read it and understand it.
I can answer that first, I guess, and I think a big part of it is like the team that I had to work on. Like I wouldn't have felt comfortable doing this myself, right? I feel like this is something that like, in order to make a comic like this, you need a team of people that can like look at it and read it and like come at it from their own perspectives and say like, this is confusing, or like, I don't know about the framing of this like certain point. I think a big part of making it accessible is talking to people like from different backgrounds and who have different missions across the state to get a sense of like what's working for different people. I mean, I have my own way of writing that like tends to be this like sort of compound sentences across like 3 panels, right? Like, and I have like my own formula for that, but I think that the clarity really comes through in these like, you know, I showed the emails of like all these like different edits from different people coming in and saying like, this is a little bit confusing, or like you could clarify this a little bit more, this could be a little bit more simple. So I think that for me, like a big part of why it's engaging is that like collaborative element of being able to bring in lots of different perspectives to it. Do you have any thoughts on that, Susan?
Well, I agree that working with a team really helped. And I think that, I mean, in a way, I mean, that's what democracy is, right, is working with a team. It means that I can stand up and say a lot of things, and then someone else stands up and says a lot of things, and then you look at the Venn diagram of where those overlap, which of this stuff can we move forward with together. And it makes you condense and your message to make sure that it's the part that fits with the other messages. Which part am I most invested in moving forward? Which part of that message? And so things really, I feel like, you know, like maple syrup process, it got boiled down, you know, to the very essence of the things that each of us felt most needed to be included, and some of them were contradictory, just like freedom and unity, and they made it in anyway, and I think that makes the document stronger and more resonant for a larger audience.
Yeah, and Susan, this question might be like a good way to talk about what I think was like one of the central challenges here is like making something that like acknowledges difficult history and like doesn't like immediately turn people off from reading it, right? Like we need to be able to talk about like some of the difficult things about the state and to be like really inclusive of people without like using language that is going to like make half of the state like not pick up the comic. I think that was like a central challenge in making this, and probably like with any of the graphic guides or things that are distributed in this kind of way, where we really are going for like an audience that isn't like of a certain partisan nature. That's a big part of the accessibility question for me, I know.
Yeah, I agree, and especially at this moment when we talked about what polarized times we have, and there are people out there who will, that, you know, if they're looking for something to hate in here, they'll find it. You know, it's there. It's just, you know, there's something in there for everybody to hate. But I think that the thing that those opinions are going to be at the very edges, I think, of where Vermonters are right now, and I think that we're working to move forward together, and I think there's way more to move forward with in this than to see as ideological or extreme on any end.
Yeah, just to follow up on that point, Susan, I think that is like a really great thing about this format too, and this ability to like pretty inexpensively put a bunch of these in like a classroom, is that like I think criticism of this comic or the approach or things that were left out or things that given too much space like can be kind of generative too, right? It's a way to start a conversation about how people feel about the state or feel about these different aspects. So I look forward to that type of criticism as well. That can be generative.
I feel like I know a lot of the answers to the questions because I was just next to you while you were working on a lot. But I guess I'm wondering, so did both of you ever approach the comic from the, in terms of thinking about it, of the binary political spectrum that we're living in right now? Like, I know that you did research on like the conservative tradition in Vermont, but did you like talk to anyone who identifies as conservative for like when you were making the comic, or was it more based on like the research, I guess?
Yeah, we had a great conversation about this yesterday, actually, and about, like, I was actually thinking about this as, like, Vermont seems like a little bit less, like, throttled by, like, the national discourse than, like, elsewhere. Like, we do have, like, I think different variations of, like, political thought in Vermont than you see in, like, sort of the big national discourse. And we were talking about Frank Bryan, who was, like, sort of a key resource in the town meeting scholarship, is like identifying as like conservative, but like also like reading Murray Bookchin, and like, you know, like there's like, I think the different political ideologies are still a lot more mixed here than maybe elsewhere. Susan, did you have anything that you were thinking about with that? Oh, your audio cut out.
Oops, sorry about that. Yeah, it's really easy, especially in our current media environment, to assume that the nationalized framing that we see on issues is actually how we experience local democracy, and I think it isn't. And the less that it is, the better. Because those nationalized framings, they've already been chewed up and spit out and completely sort of digested by these folks that I mentioned, conflict entrepreneurs, people who really would love to frame things exactly this way because they know that it's red meat for their base. But lots of stuff we deal with in local democracy, it just hasn't been through that mill yet. And so I can say, well, here's my experience, and you can say, here's my experience, and it's not about my ideology or my identity. It's just about how it is to live in this town, whether we're talking about what to do about the potholes or the dog licenses or the recreational trail, environmental, economic, social issues that are very real and local. That's where I find a tremendous amount of, if not hope, at least, a sense of forward motion. Because we don't have to accept these nationalized, polarized framings, and we can just, figure out what the right thing is for us, using the infrastructure, the civic infrastructure, the tools, the public opportunities to be on committees or to have an ad hoc conversation or to even just talk with each other on the sidelines at a soccer game as neighbors. To move forward to make our communities better.
I think we have time for about one more question. Before we get to that last question, so if you've been thinking about asking that, now's a great time to raise your hand. But before we get to that, I wanted to pause just to thank Junction Arts and Media, Chico Eastridge, and the rest of the team from JAM for allowing us to do a live broadcast of today's event. You can take a look at them. I think they used to be known as CCTV, but they are now JAM, or Junction Arts and Media, based here in White River Junction. So thank you again to them for being able to broadcast today's event. And was there any last final questions? Well, there's two. We can go for it.
I don't know what I'm talking about, but I was very interested in a few of the points made that feel connected to me. Like I didn't even realize there are no billboards here until this moment, which is wild, but that's true. And I was thinking about the co-ops and why there are so many co-ops, and just like it's interesting to me that there's sort of like a lack of corporate interest in like, or like maybe obvious corporate interest, if that makes sense, maybe even compared to other states,
Yeah.
places. I'm just wondering how you think, yeah, like what role that plays in like, almost like how easily like explainable the local government is here. Because I feel like if you did that in a major city or a different state, there would be so many layers that like would be connected to, I don't know, greedier places.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know what
Do you have any thoughts on that, Susan? Or do you
I
want me to
do,
go first?
and you do know what you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly.
Even if you think you don't. Absolutely, there's a sense of scale. And you know, the thing is, Vermont has we have a lot of small communities, so there is access to democratic change that you might not feel if you live in a really big state. Although in those larger places, you might feel it if your neighborhood is really active. So it's not that Vermont's sense of scale is unique. It can be found in other places. And participatory budgeting, for example, is super active in the neighborhoods of New York and Chicago. So there are ways to learn from what if there are bits and pieces of success that we can draw from in Vermont, and help those lessons be brought to other places. That's terrific. And I think that one of the things you're talking about is sort of human scale, and that's one of the terms that Frank Bryan used a lot in his research, is making democracy on a human scale. And in our rural background, agricultural background, that things were much more at a human scale. I mean, you sort of mentioned corporations and some of the bigification in terms of corporations and government both, that have happened in larger places that kind of skipped Vermont. When it did skip Vermont, it was mostly because that we didn't have the larger scale to make it worthwhile. And then all of a sudden, here we are with communities that people really want to find really appealing in times of COVID or in times of climate change. All of a sudden, some of the models that we have here for cooperating, like co-ops, are appealing. And one of the terms that Frank Bryan used was that he felt like Vermont kind of got lapped. It's almost like here we were kind of going along being this agricultural place, and the rest of the world, sped by us, and all of a sudden we're ahead because we still have some of the qualities that the rest of the world would like to emulate. We just have to be really conscious of which of those are advantages and which are exclusionary, which leave people out. Some of them are absolutely the wave of the future, and some of them we have to leave behind. We just have to examine them carefully.
So we said one last question, but I think we have a bonus question here in the back.
Hey, this is kind of an open-ended question a little bit, but whenever I talk to my landlord, he's always telling me about how I should become more involved with the community because, in his words, everybody is old and decrepit like him. I was just wondering, in your research or in your conversations you had in this project, whether there are any conversations you had about the future of local government, especially kind of given the population drain of Vermont and his fear was losing a lot of local traditions and local kind of knowledge. And whether there's any plans in place to kind of help maintain that.
Yeah, I would love to hear Susan's answer on that. And from my perspective as well is I think that there are a lot of ways to be involved. There is a problem in Vermont, whether you're talking about the legislature or municipal government, that it does not pay often at all. And even if you're in the legislature, it's a part-time job, right? It's hard to be a legislator. It's a lot of time, and you're not very well compensated for it. And that's it's a problem across the board with being involved with these kind of things. You need to be able to find ways of making money elsewhere. But I do think that for people interested in getting involved in some aspect of the community, for me it's about thinking about what sort of skills or values in yourself do you want to develop, and then finding a place to plug in. I think as Susan often says, is everyone can find a different place to plug in. I was really interested in restorative justice because I was interested in alternative models to the legal system in the courts, but I was also interested in the empathy that it develops and the skills from that. So I think there's lots of different ways to be involved outside of government and local communities, based off of what you're looking for, what you want to develop in yourself.
Yeah, I think you're right on there, Dan, in terms of and the first question to ask is what am I bringing? What brings me energy and joy? So am I a person who likes to work with my hands? We've got an energy committee in our town that did not come from the top down, definitely came from the bottom up, because there were some folks who were really interested in working against climate change. And right now they're hammers and nails making window inserts for anybody who needs better insulation in their town. We've got a conservation commission that builds bluebird boxes, that maintains trails in our town. There are really great historic committees in towns that will, I know Peacham did this amazing thing where they, it was during COVID, but they researched the abolitionists and the history of abolition in the town of Peacham, which it has this fascinating history that who knew, and made a walk that people could take through the town to see some of the historic sites that had to do with race relations in Peacham. So it sort of depends on where your passion is, and if you approach your select board or whatever with an idea and they are maybe kind of overwhelmed by their own existence, that doesn't necessarily mean, and maybe they'll be like, yeah, you go, or maybe they'll be like, that makes me tired. Do it yourself, DIY, and that's always going to resonate. My experience is that's what resonates. If you do have local officials, what they're going to see is people who have the energy to get things done. That's where suddenly you become way more valuable, and you can move forward with your projects just by doing them. That's a currency that's really important at the local level. So bring your love, and see what you can make of it.
Great, thank you. I wanted to say once again thank you to Dan and Susan for joining us today. This was a great conversation to be a part of. I also wanted to thank you all for joining us. We really appreciate your attendance. Thank you again to Vermont Humanities and the Office of the Secretary of State for this partnership. I think it's really awesome to see what happens when people can get together and put together such an awesome project. If you're curious at some of the other graphic guides that have been put out by CCS through our applied cartooning, go to cartoonstudies.org, where you can see and download free copies of digital copies of the comics, such as Freedom and Unity, the Democracy comic. We've also got graphic guides on literacy and reading and mental health. So again, that's cartoonstudies.org. Also, thanks again to Junction Arts and Media for doing the live broadcast for us today. For those of you who are here in person, there's a lot to digest. So if you want to go back and watch this, you can take a look at the broadcast later on Junction Arts and Media's website. Thank you all for joining us.